and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Here's what we're looking at.
This individual is a bad dude.
We will not justify killing people for the things that they have done.
Alder people vote to pay more than $8 million in taxpayer money to settle police misconduct cases, but not without a debate.
Plus, a push in City Council to end the practice of allowing tipped workers to be paid less than the legal minimum wage.
After workers at the Museum of Science and Industry vote to unionize, a look at the wave of institutions in Chicago moving to organize.
And a new research project aims to track the impact of climate change across Chicago's communities.
Now to some of today's top stories. Illinois U.S. Senator Dick Durbin is calling for major ethics changes at the U.S. Supreme Court. Durbin's announcement comes in the wake of another investigation from news outlet ProPublica. This one detailing alleged trips that Justice Samuel Alito took with a billionaire who had cases before the High Court. Alito failed to report on any disclosure forms on those trips. ProPublica had highlighted numerous perks a billionaire doled out to Justice Clarence Thomas that Thomas also failed to disclose. Durbin leads the Senate Judiciary Committee and says the committee will mark up legislation imposing new ethics requirements on every Supreme Court justice. In a statement, Durbin said, quote, "The Supreme Court is in an ethical crisis of its own making due to the acceptance of lavish gifts from parties with business before the court that several justices have not disclosed. The reputation and credibility of the court are at stake. Chief Justice Roberts could resolve this today, but he has not acted."
An attorney for the family of a man killed at a Juneteenth celebration in Willowbrook says he's looking into whether to file a wrongful death lawsuit against the property owner of the shopping center where the event took place.
There's nothing that we can do to bring Reginald back, unfortunately. And there's no amount of money in the world that will compensate for the family's loss. But in the eyes of the law, the only way that we are able to compensate for those damages is monetarily. And that is, for the benefit of his children.
Sitting alongside the family of 31-year-old shooting victim Reginald Meadows, attorney Robert Fakori says he's looking into whether the promoter of the event and/or property owners of the shopping center at Route 83 and Honeysuckle Rose Lane should be held liable in civil court. 22 other people were injured during the weekend shooting.
Two more Chicago public high schools have voted to remove Chicago police personnel that serve as resource officers at the schools. The board did approve a slightly more expensive contract for the resource officers system-wide, up from $10.2 to $10.3 million this year. But that's well below the $33 million the district spent on the officers in 2019 before schools started voting to have them removed. Austin High School voted this year to remove one of its two officers, and then Marshall High voted to remove both of its SRO officers.
From endangered to landmark, the Warehouse, a West Loop building credited as being the birthplace of house music, is now a Chicago landmark. City Council approved the designation today, just 3 months after Preservation Chicago listed it among the city's most endangered buildings. Opening in 1977, the 3-story building was once the hottest dance club in town, where DJ Frankie Knuckles spun up what we now know as house music, and was also considered to be a safe haven for Black, brown, and queer people. There's more of this story on our website.
House music is just so popular
And
all
it's
over
so
the world,
Chicago.
and it started right there.
Right here.
In that building, so historic. And coming up in the program, efforts to unionize at museums all across the city.
But first, a tense debate over police misconduct settlements inside City Hall. Heather Sharon has that story next.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Chicago taxpayers are set to pay $1 million to the family of a man shot and killed by a police officer who intentionally turned off his body-worn camera. It's one of 3 settlements City Council voted on at today's meeting. Mayor Johnson says today's vote is part of his push to repair the lingering damage from Chicago's history of police misconduct.
We still have a ways to go in order to ensure that blackness is not criminalized and or brutalized.
And WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. So one of these cases, the case of Sherelle Brown, a 26-year-old who died in May 2019. Tell us the details of this.
Well, he was shot to death by a Chicago police officer after a brief foot chase. Officers were looking for an armed robbery suspect, and they chased him before he was shot 6 times by Officer Joseph Liscandrello, who had just turned off his body-worn camera.
And the recommendation from city lawyers to settle the lawsuit brought by Brown's mother, it brought a strong response from some aldermen, including Alderman Nick Sposato. So let's listen to him.
This individual was not an honor roll student. This individual was not a choir boy at church. This individual was a bad dude.
A bad dude, to use Sposato's terms. Is there a criminal record here that's an issue?
Well, it's not an issue here. What the city council had to decide today was whether they could save taxpayer monies by taking this suit to a jury verdict. And the city council decided that they couldn't, because not only would they have to explain why the officer turned off his body-worn camera, they would have to sort of hope that the expense of a trial was less than that and a jury verdict.
And to that point, another alderman, Jason Irvin, warned that not settling this lawsuit could cost taxpayers more in the long run. Here's some of that.
At the end of the day, all we want is constitutionally sound policing. It's easy to roll the dice when it's not your money.
So not just this lawsuit, but multiple lawsuits settled today. What's the final cost for taxpayers?
It will cost taxpayers $8.8 million to settle these 3 lawsuits. The biggest payment, $7.25 million, will go to a man who was wrongfully convicted of arson and double murder. He spent nearly 30 years in prison. The final settlement will pay $500,000 to a man who was tased by a Chicago police officer who is now facing criminal charges in connection with that event. In all, today's settlements account for nearly 11% of the yearly budget that Chicago puts aside to pay for police misconduct settlements.
And then that just adds to the $500 million total in these settlements over the last several years and counting, Heather. All right, thanks very much. And we'll see you, of course, in just a few minutes in Spotlight Politics. That's right, it's Wednesday. And you can read Heather's full story on our website. It's all at WTTW.com/news.
A city council push to end the practice of allowing tipped workers to be paid less than the minimum wage, tackling the city's chronically underfunded pension plans. Another weekend marred by violence as the search for Chicago's next police superintendent continues, and another U.S. Supreme Court justice embroiled in an ethics scandal. Here with all that is our Spotlight Politics team, Heather Sharon, Amanda Vinicky, and Paris Schutz. Welcome back, team. So allies of Mayor Brandon Johnson launched an effort to require Chicago businesses to pay their workers the same minimum hourly wage, regardless of whether they earn tips, touting it as a way to expand youth employment. Here's Johnson.
If individuals are going to be able to afford to live in the city of Chicago, we're going to have wages that reflect the cost increase that is creeping up on all of us. Any effort that we put forth as government to secure the economics for working people certainly places us in a far better position to have a sustainable economy.
Heather, is this going to be a big fight like in 2019 when the restaurant industry killed a similar proposal?
It's not going to be a small fight, but the fact that the mayor and his floor leader and several city council committee chairs are all in favor of it sets up it to be one of the mayor's highest priorities in the upcoming negotiations over his 2024 spending plan. Very different than in 2019 when the restaurant industry was able to prevail on former Mayor Lori Lightfoot that this would be too expensive for them. However, we're going to see a lot of debate about this because Chicago's restaurants are still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, and they are still facing a staffing crunch. And so this is all going to sort of play into whether or not this is the way to go. But you heard Johnson. He seems like this is a kill multiple birds with a single stone initiative.
Paris, a working group created by Mayor Johnson to tackle the problem of the city's underfunded pensions met for the first time today. What are the options for fixing this, given that the mayor has publicly committed to not raising property taxes?
Well, first of all, some interesting names on this working group, including John Catanzara, the head of the FOP, although it makes sense because police pensions are a big part of the issue at hand. But the solution here has always been the same. It's not complicated. It's one of two things. Either you drag out the amortization period, and so you spend more years paying to get to this 90% funding level from 24% collectively where they're at right now, or you pour more money in there. And the city has poured above their required contribution this year, and still, despite all that, it's only making incremental progress in that long-term debt. So, and then there's going to be the casino. There's going to be money from that going to the pension. But I mean, there's no rabbit in the hat here. This working group, it's interesting. There's a lot of people. But if they come up with some solution that's not one of those two things, I'll be very, very interested.
If it's putting more money in, though, the question is, of course, where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and Amanda, I saw you nodding your head as well. You know, what are the chances that legislators in Springfield would be willing to use some state money to help? Good one, Brandes.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. I mean, the state doesn't have money for that either. The state has its own pension problem. In fact, if anything, what you could see is perhaps added pension debt as we're looking at these tier 2 pensions, as you're looking at trying to bring up the pensions paid to firefighters and police. This is something that the legislature held off doing at the behest of former Mayor Lightfoot, but this working group, especially with members like Catanzara, could say, hey, wait, we want fixes there that would add to how much the city owes.
Let's give context to that, because when there was pension reform 10, 12 years ago, this was constitutional, where they added a tier 2. So for newer workers that going into the system, they're paying into the system, but their benefits are going to be diminished compared to their elders. Now these bills are going to change that, which means an added bill for the city of Chicago into those pension funds.
Well, what it's going to do, it's going to give Mayor Johnson the ability to go to Springfield and say, give me the ability to raise the real estate transfer tax. Give me the ability to raise other revenue other than property taxes, and why you're going to see a concerted push from people like Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa to impose that head tax on big corporations who have lots of employees in Chicago, so that that burden is no longer borne by property owners who have faced a lot of hikes in recent years, but the wealthy corporations that sort of maybe have a little bit more to give, according to the mayor.
And Heather, you know, new mayors, they often, quote, sort of discover that the fiscal situation for the city is worse than they thought it was when they were running for the office, and tend to sort of backtrack on some of those campaign promises. Do you think he'll have to backtrack on his no new property taxes pledge when the economic reality bites?
So his platform is very clear. There are no new property taxes coming, and he has vowed to repeal the automatic property tax increase that Lori Lightfoot put on the books back in 2021. So that leaves him with few options, because that is the most effective, efficient way to raise revenue for the city of Chicago, which means he's got to pull more rabbits out of the hats, and that is very difficult.
But let's be clear, CPS raised or is going to vote to raise its property tax levy, and Johnson has said, well, that's Mayor Lightfoot's school board. She appointed those people. I'm not breaking my promise because that's not me that has anything to do with that. And he is right. He doesn't have really anything to do with that.
But he has clout. He's used
he has clout.
He
Sure.
has.
He
could make some calls.
So to say that no property taxes are going to go up over the next 4 years just because of that pledge, that's hard to believe.
Not a guarantee. Paris, as we heard earlier, Senator Durbin's preparing legislation on Supreme Court ethics. This comes as Supreme Court Justice. This time, Justice Alito has become embroiled in an ethics scandal. What is likely to be included in Durbin's legislation?
Well, it would probably be, and I think it's kind of unclear, but they would have to report, like other judges, they would have to report their conflicts or these gifts as income, and then recuse themselves if there's a conflict of interest. And Alito, after the stellar reporting, we should say, by ProPublica, that found that he had taken a $100,000 private jet from a billionaire conservative activist with business before the Supreme Court to this fishing trip, this elaborate fishing trip in Alaska. And then he comes on and he preempts it by going to the Wall Street Journal and saying, it was kind of a rustic cabin. It wasn't really elite, and that seat would have just gone.
It wasn't fancy.
$100,000 plane ticket, and I had no reason to believe there was any conflict of interest. But make no mistake, the appearance here is terrible. I mean, it appears to be some kind of pay-to-play type of behavior. Not saying that legally that's what it is, but these Supreme Court justices need to hold themselves to a higher standard, and it seems like so far, as we know, Thomas and Alito can't help themselves but to say yes to these lavish, amazing vacations.
On its own, and
It doesn't
that's
look
something
like
that
it.
we have seen the court
John
really
Roberts is
pushing
the
back
Chief
on.
Justice, and as Durbin says here, he's in a tough position. He wants to maintain the credibility of the court, but does he want to go out and admit there's a problem?
So before we get out of here, another violent weekend. 75 people shot, 13 fatally over the Juneteenth holiday weekend. Heather, given this level of violence, what do we know about the search for the new and permanent police superintendent?
Well, it's coming down to the wire. The Community Safety Accountability Commission has 23 more days to get their picks for 3 finalists to Mayor Johnson. And there was a little bit of controversy about it today at City Hall. 19 alderpeople, most of whom are on the more conservative side, expressed frustration and anger that it does not appear that Brian McDermott, the number 3 ranking officer, is sort of advanced into that pool of finalists, and they want to know why. However, the board says, look, we haven't done our work yet. We're not complete, so don't weigh in now.
They're standing by what they've done
days
so far.
Right.
They're standing by
wrap
it.
this up. Don't
But
call
this
us
is
done
a
yet.
huge decision that is facing Mayor Johnson right down the
Marquee decision
pike.
for him, of course. All right, that's Spotlight. Heather, Amanda, Paris, thanks, y'all. Up next, unionization efforts at Chicago cultural institutions. But first, a look at the weather.
This past weekend, many workers at the Museum of Science and Industry voted to unionize. According to unofficial results released by AFSCME, nearly 3/4 of employees who voted cast a ballot in favor of representation. It's part of a recent pro-labor wave, which many backers say was spurred on by the effects of COVID-19. Those organizing efforts have included several local cultural institutions like the Peggy Nota Barrett Nature Museum and Newberry Library. As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, workers say they want their protections to match the prestige of the institutions where they work.
We're really just trying to make the museum a better place.
But Education Project Manager Margie Lafreniere says pro-union workers at the Museum of Science and Industry have been called bullies and faced heavy pressure.
Upper management have stopped by my desk like upwards of 5 times a day sometimes. It feels like there's undue pressure to not support my colleagues.
In a statement, the Museum of Science and Industry said, quote, "We respect an employee's right to choose or decline union representation. Our priority is to continue building our positive workplace culture that supports the Museum of Science and Industry and benefits the greater Chicago community." The vote to unionize at MSI is the latest in a string of museums and other cultural institutions in Chicago. The wave began with the Art Institute. Paper conservator Maria Cristina Rivera says her job is a great blend of art and science, but that the work environment could be challenging.
The values that we had were very aspirational. We were not living them, whereas management seemed to come from a place where they thought this was a reality.
The Art Institute's union election was certified in January of 2022. Rivera says they've been bargaining for more than a year and wants to see good wages and benefits secured for full and part-time employees.
I think our management representatives took a long time to really come to the table with a headspace where they were really bargaining in good faith. I think we're getting closer to that.
In a statement, the Art Institute says it deeply values its employees and wants to meet their needs. Quote, "We are pleased with the progress we have made, have agreement on nearly all non-economic provisions, and are having productive discussions around an economic proposal. We are optimistic we can reach an equitable agreement." Field Museum workers aren't as far along in the process. Their election results were certified in March. Adrienne Stroop works with vertebrate fossils in the collections department. She says the high turnover rate was one reason she backed the unionization effort. Even though they haven't started bargaining yet, Stroop says organizing has helped bring together workers who were once far more siloed.
People have very different roles, from housekeeping to collections to PR. Everybody is very skilled, but very, very specific skills. And so we want to make sure everybody is heard and we can address things that affect everybody.
MSI facilitator Al Pope echoed those concerns. A lifelong museum attendee turned employee, Pope said greater protections for workers of all backgrounds will also benefit visitors.
I think it's very important for people to get informal science education from people that look like them, age-wise, like body type-wise. We have lots of gender non-conforming folks. We have visibility, and that is great, but visibility is not always in a positive way, and we're trying to protect each other in that way too.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
For its part, the Field Museum said in a statement after the union election this spring, quote, "While the election process produced strong feelings and contrasting views, we are once again unified in serving our visitors, our community, and our world. Our management team is ready to begin good faith bargaining over an initial contract with AFSCME." Up next, tracking climate change block by block. Stay with us.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
The impact of climate change is being felt in ways large and small, but it is increasingly clear that the impact of climate change is not felt equally. Now, a team of researchers from Argonne National Laboratory is working with community organizations in Chicago to track the impact of climate change across the city. The hope is that the data collected will help them develop strategies to become more resilient to the extreme weather that climate change brings. Producer Paul Kane recently met up with researchers on a rooftop at Northeastern Illinois University to find out more about the project called Crocus.
Crocus stands for Community Research on Climate and Urban Science. It is a project funded by the United States Department of Energy to really understand a city like Chicago and how it can be impacted by climate change. The simulations that we run on supercomputers, the pixel size, the grid cell, if you will, is about 50 by 50 miles. So you think about a city like Chicago, that's the entire city. So the way it models Evanston is the same way it models Chatham or West Woodlawn. So what we're able to do in going on a block by block basis is really study how the things that humans have done, drainage, air quality, whether you've got green or grey infrastructure, how that influences the outcomes for the communities in Chicago. This is the scanning thermal camera. Everything you see here is integrated in with what we call an edge computing device that combines data from our air quality sensing instruments, our meteorological instruments, packages it, sends it back to our supercomputing center where it's made analysis ready and used in our simulation efforts. As soon as we come out here and put our instruments out here and turn them on, we started seeing interesting things. Even as recently as last week, where we had the Canadian wildfires come through, we could see the air quality signal out here, and using our LiDAR and radar systems, we could see how the smoke from Canada was actually interacting with air quality in the city of Chicago. So this is one of our advanced remote sensing instruments. It's called a microwave rain radar. It's kind of like the radar that you see on the TV weather, but instead of looking out across Chicago, this looks straight up. And what this device gives us is this like super detailed HD picture of the structure of storms so that we can look at the physics inside them, simulate them in the computer, and see how we can come up with more equitable solutions like green solutions to the climate crisis and flooding in Chicago. When they have that storm in the computer, they can then say, well, I'm going to simulate this rainfall, but now I'm going to pave over the entire city and see how bad the flooding is. Or I'm going to plant a lot of trees and see what the flooding is like. So one of the ideas of Crocus is to get past that trees are good to how good are trees? How much do they help ameliorate the worst flooding in Chicago?
My historic family home, we had 4 major flood events. I have not one shred of memorabilia from my childhood because all of it was either washed away or burned away when electrical fire started from the flooding.
When it comes to rainfall, water moves. It doesn't stay where it falls. So our hydrological system, our engineered hydrological system in Chicago leads to a lot of the inequities we see. Basically, we need to engineer a city where when it rains, it's not just the poorest suburbs that flood all the time.
in the Greater Chatham community. We have the highest number of flood claims of any community in Chicagoland. So we know what the problem is. What we want is solutions, and we're hoping that Crocus can help us look at what to do on an individual level as homeowners, property owners, business owners, and also collectively as a community to stop the flooding.
And researchers expect to have a network of 21 advanced meteorological stations across the city, all up and running by the fall of 2025.
And that is our show for this Wednesday night. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. Nearly a year after the Dobbs decision, we're live from Planned Parenthood in Waukegan.
And we speak with two Chicago LGBTQ+ pioneers who are subjects of the documentary Art and Pep. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and enjoy the summer solstice.
Oh, yeah. Have a good night.
All done.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a proud sponsor of diversity, equity, and inclusion-focused free continuing legal education for lawyers throughout the region.